Let's see what are the steps behind the Granger test. So step number 1 includes regress and current GDP on all lect GDP terms, but please do not include the lect M variables in this regression. And from this regression, we obtained the so-called restricted residual sum of squares. After we've done this, we run a new regression where this time we include the lect M terms, and from this regression, we need to save the unrestricted residual sum of squares. And the null hypothesis will be that the coefficients of alpha are simultaneously equal to 0. So it means that the lect M terms do not belong in the regression. If you go back to our original one, here it is, the lect values of M, and here is the alpha coefficient. So we test whether they are simultaneously equal to 0. And we are already familiar with the kind of test that allows us to test this kind of hypothesis. This is the F test, where we take the restricted sum of squares and we subtract the unrestricted sum of squares from it divided by M, and divide everything by the restricted sum of squares and divide by n minus k, where n is the sample size, the number of observations, m is equal to the number of lect M terms, so the number of restrictions, and k, this is the number of parameters in the unrestricted regression. And if we find out that the computed F value is higher than the critical F value at the chosen level of significance, then we can reject the null hypothesis, in which case the lect M terms belong in the regression. So we can say that M causes GDP, Granger causes GDP. And the same steps can be repeated to test the other equation. So the equation for GDP, that is whether GDP Granger causes M. And here on this slide, I have presented the estimation results for our example. So, and as from these results, you can get that the F value for the direction of causality from M to GDP is 2.68. And in this case, we reject the null hypothesis that the coefficients are simultaneously equal to 0, which means that they are not equal to 0. And when we check the direction of causality from GDP to M, that GDP Granger causes M, we get that the F value is 0.56, suggesting that we cannot reject the null hypothesis, which means that GDP does not Granger causes M. And in this case, the results suggest, as you already guessed, that the direction of causality is from money to GDP, but not the other way around. Unfortunately, this test has its own assumptions and limitations that we need to be familiar with. So first of all, the variables in our analysis must be stationary. So if you have non-stationary variables, you need to apply the techniques from the previous lecture to make them stationary. So either detrending or applying force differences. And as you guessed, we also need to know the leg length. So how many legs we should include into the equation. And luckily, we have some econometric tools that allow us to do that. For example, Akaike or Schwarz information criterion. And the choice of leg length is very important because the direction of causality very much depends on the number of leg terms included. Sometimes you will see that when you include 2 legs and when you include 3 legs, you get a completely different picture. So therefore, you need to be very, very sure and confident that you've chosen the correct leg length. Another important assumption is that the error terms must be uncorrelated. So if it happens that they are autocorrelated, again, you need to apply the techniques that we learned during the autocorrelation lecture to make the error terms uncorrelated. There is also a nice suggestion for you that when you will be testing for causality, there is no need to present the estimates of the lect coefficients. You just need to present the results of the F test, and this will be enough. Be also aware of spurious causality. For example, let's assume that the true causality relationship is from money supply to the interest rate and from the interest rate to GDP. But as you can see, in our case, we have only analyzed the causality from M to GDP. And if it happens that the true causality is actually from the money supply to the interest rate and then from the interest rate to GDP, in this case, we have spurious causality because we've missed an important channel here. But luckily, we have a solution for this, and it's called the vector autoregression, which I will discuss in the next section.